million tonnes of coal were mined in the United Kingdom. The price. The death of 344 men and boys at the Pretoria. In 1910, over 24 million tonnes of coal were mined in the United Kingdom. The price. The death of 344 men and boys at the Pretoria Pit near Bolton. At the time, Britain's second biggest mining disaster. On the 21st of December 1910, Christmas festivities were forgotten. It became known as Black Christmas. Nearly every household in the town of West Bolton near Bolton was affected. Some households lost every male member, father, son, brother and uncle. This is the story of the Pretoria Pit Disaster. Britain's greatness in the 19th century was based on a plentiful supply of coal. Many regions in Britain practically owed their entire existence to the presence of coal. One of these was the town of West Bolton, just west of Bolton. Its population rose from 4,547 in 1851 to 12,900 in 1901. In 1921, over half the resident males were miners. The mining of coal has always exacted a heavy price in miners' lives. Technology has continually tried to catch up to the reality of mining.
It's technology chasing safety to make the mines safer, and they're safer now than they've ever been. But obviously in the early days they weren't very safe. I mean, at one bit, to get rid of gas, they used to have a bloke who used to douse himself in water with sacks over his back and crawl in with a lighted taper.
We will look at individual stories of tragedy and heroism. We will look at the evidence provided by the official inquiry and what effect, if any, the disaster had on the future of mining safety and legislation. First, we will look at the history of coal mining in Britain to put the Pretoria Pit into its historical context. Then we will look more specifically at the Pretoria disaster.
Coal was first extracted from outcrops, where coal seams ran very close to the surface. Adits or drifts were driven into the outcrops, and small areas of coal would be worked out. These workings would eventually become flooded, or a build-up of gas known as fire damp, which was principally methane or CH4, would occur.
Well, fire damp is a gas that is inherent in the coal. Because it's vegetable, it's wood and vegetation that's rotted down and being compressed. The gas is allowed out of it when it's crushed and smashed.
When coal became more inaccessible near the surface, shallow shafts would be sunk, known as bell pits, because of their shape, from which the coal in a small radius of the shaft could be mined and then the shaft allowed to fall in.
They went from that to ladder pit. These were sunk to the depth of 70 to 120 feet. The usual cost of the shaft was 50 to 100 pounds. And these were men could go down ladders in this basis and get to the bottom and work the coal down below. This was better organised. Coal was got and packed into corbs, which were baskets, circular baskets, placed on wooden sleds and dragged to the shaft's bottom. A horse gin was usually used to wind the coal to the surface. Again, no artificial ventilation was attempted.
With increasing demand for coal, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, shafts of greater depth were sunk, and one of the main problems with deep mining was flooding. The Newcomen atmospheric engine was introduced in 1712 to pump water from the workings. James Watt's steam engine, invented in 1769, enabled miners to work seams of greater depth, while steam power was applied not only to pumping water, but to winding, haulage and ventilation in the mines.
Yeah, where we're going now, we're going to pass three coal seams, right? The flopped and thin, flopped and thick, and old hard seam. The one we're going to, which is at a depth of 460 feet, it's called a new hard seam. This shaft was sunk to that level in 1876. It's probably one of the oldest working mining sites in Europe, this. At that time, the colliery was owned by a young lady, Emma Lister-Kay. She inherited the business from her father, John Lister-Kay. And so you're actually going to go back. We're passing points that have been mined over 200 years ago. But what they would do is sink the shaft to a level, work the coal seam as far as they could naturally with natural ventilation, come out of there and then sink the shaft deeper. But you get to a certain point where winding coal up and down shaft takes a certain length of time. Also, it's very expensive to sink shafts. So when we get to a certain level, we then drive roadways which slope down underground. We call them cross-measure drifts. You go down to coal seams further. So where we're going is the fourth coal seam that's been worked. There has been 3 below that what have been worked out as well.
As mining coal went further underground, the room and pillar system was adopted. Where surface support was needed, pillars of coal of the required size were left. Where no surface support was needed, pillars were wholly or partially extracted. It is also known as pillar and stall.
A pillar and stall system. At the front is a man, he's called a hewer. He's actually swinging a pick to dig coal out. What he does, picks that coal off that coal face and he pushes it, lifts it or shovels it into that wooden box. It's called a corve. He's the strongest member of the family team. He's working semi-naked, usually they would be naked as well. We would be at about the limit of natural ventilation. We don't have fans to ventilate pits at this stage, early 1800s. When he's put the coal in that wooden box, the corve, you get next strongest member of the family, be his wife or his daughter. The small teenagers, kids down to probably 6, 8 years old. Their job's called a hurrier. The hurrier drags that box along this road where they would normally do it in the dark. Can't afford a candle, right? They've got to work 6 days a week, 12, 13 hours a day, just to survive. Bare minimum, next door to starvation. Everything that they earn, they basically give back to the owner of the mine, because the candles that they use, the tools they use, the clothes they wear, the food they buy, the house they live in, all belong to the mine owners. They're actually next door to being slaves. And in fact, there are instances where people who were prosecuted for leaving one colliery and trying to get a job at another without asking if they could change jobs.
So you have a family. Then 1842, the Act took women and children under 10 out of mines. Well, that bloke then had lost 2/3 of his workforce and he'd have to pay.
And we've got the chap there, a young child, 5, 6 years old. Pull him out of bed on a morning at 4 o'clock, bring them to a place like this and leave them in the dark.
Yeah, on pillar and stall workings, and one at collieries that have been underground, they were pillar and stall workings, but they were under North Sea. In fact, they went 7 miles around North Sea, and if you could have, they worked pillar and stall, and if you could have taken the roof off them, you would look down and see it looked just like a draft board. A 10-yard pillar of coal left, a 10-yard taken out, 10-yard left, 10-yard taken out.
The room and pillar method of extracting coal was eventually superseded by the longwall method, and as its name implies, this consisted of working at a long face of the seam and extracting all the available coal.
At each coal face you have a coal seam. You've got to get supplies, men and ventilation up, so you have 2 roadways, one at either end of a coal face. As you take the coal out, the coal face advances, so you extend those roadways behind it. The distance between one roadway and the next, the length of the coal face, can be between 100 and 300 metres. When you've taken the coal out, you do not want a big open space behind you, because if you leave it supported, gas accumulates in there. Plus it short circuits the air. You need the air up to the coal face where the men are actually working. So we use a total caving system. We advance the supports constantly and we purposely let the roof collapse behind us. A total caving system. You need that void to be filled with the roof debris as it comes down.
Pretoria Pit used the long wall method, and by the time it was in production, 2 faces of one seam used mechanical coal cutting and an electrically driven haulage system. The endless rope.
This is the endless rope. a person would attach tubs of coal or supplies would be to take a long lashing chain with a hook at either end. While this rope was running, they'd take the chain like that. Learned to do this as a 16-year-old boy. They'd take the chain and throw it round the rope, catch it, bring it over like that, and then what they do then is drop that chain into there. That grips like a vice. That'll pull 30 tonne of coal. The only problem is if you take your eyes off the ball, the fingers end up in there.
Pretoria was the local name for the Bolton numbers 3 and 4 bank pits. The whole colliery complex was called the Bolton Colliery Company and was situated on the Bolton Park estate on the border of Atherton and West Orton, near Bolton. The company employed 2,400 people, 889 of whom worked at Pretoria. The company raised 2,400 tonnes of coal per day, roughly 1 tonne of coal per worker per day. The site of the shafts can still be seen today. The 2 shafts of the Pretoria Pit, numbers 3 and 4, were sunk between 1900 and 1901. They were 18 feet in diameter and 75 yards apart. Number 3 shaft was the upcast and number 4 was the downcast.
To explain the difference between upcast and downcast, the Fowler shaft was the upcast shaft. The principle of this was down the metal framework, open framework, fans drew fresh air down into the pit workings. These were pumped through the system using brattices, which was like a tarred sack-coloured cloth on frames to direct the fresh air into the various areas of the mine. At the other end of the pit, of the upcast shaft, which was boarded in to create a chimney effect, fans drew the mine, the contaminated gas and air out of the mine, pumped it up the shaft, because that shaft now created a chimney situation where all the waste was pumped to atmosphere above ground level so that nobody got gassed or anything like that. And that's the difference between an upcast and a downcast. If you look at them, the Fowler one is boarded to create a chimney effect.
Ventilation in the Pretoria Pit was provided by electrically driven fans of the Sirocco type, one being placed in each of the 4 mines underground to circulate air and ventilate the workings. On the surface, near to number 3 shaft, was a huge Sirocco fan, some 8.5 feet in diameter, which was used at weekends when the underground fans were stopped to allow maintenance work.
There are 17 seams of coal in this area of Lancashire. The Pretoria Pit mined 5 of these. From nearest the surface downwards, these are 146 yards down, the trencher bone, 3 foot 6 inch thick, 274 yards down, the plodder, 2 foot thick, 306 yards down, the yard, 3 foot 11 inches thick, 361 yards down, the 3/4, 1 foot 5 inch thick, and 434 yards down, the Arley, 2 foot 11 inches thick. The general dip of the seams was an average of 1 in 5.5 to the south. 3 seams were worked from one level: the plodder, the 3/4 and the yard seams.
The yard mine had 5 main working levels: the north plodder, the 3/4, the top yard or upbrow, the bottom yard, downbrow, and the south plodder. The workings were very extensive, the north plodder being the furthest at over a mile from the shaft bottom.
Mechanical coal cutting and repairs operated from 10:30 p.m. until 6:30 a.m. The coal getting shift descended at 6:45 a.m. and was wound up at 2:45 p.m. Christmas was only 4 days away at the time of the disaster. Pretoria was considered to be one of the most modern and safest collieries in the area, and despite there being evidence of gas in the mine, no one could have foreseen the extent of the disaster.
Gas occurs in large quantities in nearly all bituminous coal. The mixture of gases found in mines is known as fire damp, and it's a product of the decay of vegetable matter from which the coal seams themselves were formed.
Well, fire damp, right, it's only explosive within a certain range in atmosphere you're breathing at the moment. It's explosive between 5 and 15%. Anywhere within that range, if you introduce a naked flame or a spark, that's hot enough, it will explode. There's never a second chance, it always explodes. That's not the end of it. because that explosion lifts coal dust in the air, and believe it or not, coal dust actually explodes as well. So it propagates, you get a bigger bang, and it'll go on until it can actually extinguish itself. It's not just the gas that explodes. We also look for another gas called choke damp underground. Right, that is heavier than air. It's carbon dioxide and nitrogen, so it sinks to the floor, displaces oxygen, chokes you to death. The lamp will not burn without oxygen, so we put a large flame on. We know it sinks to the floor, so we'll walk into roadways holding the lamp like that at knee level. If it goes out, we know there's no oxygen. We turn round and come back. Simple as that.
The disaster at Pretoria was caused initially by a fire damp explosion. This would not normally in itself have led to such a massive loss of life, had it not also ignited coal dust, causing this to explode in a chain reaction throughout the workings.
Fire damp explosions are usually often limited, as accumulations of explosive mixtures are relatively small volumes compared to the total volume of air circulating in mines. The first essential for the prevention of accumulations of fire damp is an adequate quantity of air and a well-arranged ventilation system.
Nowadays, we'll look for it with these, called a methanometer. We can tell to small percentages exactly the amount of gas there is. We would hold it up to the roof like this and measure for percentages of gas. We also still use those. These are very, very reliable, a Davy lamp. Still got to use them by law, and most coal miners will tell you it's a miner's best friend. Find that gas, which we know floats to the roof, we put a very small flame on, called a testing flame, like that. We turn cap lamps off, we hold it to the roof like that. If there is any gas present, we'll measure. We can tell by the shape of the flame and the colour of it, the height of it, how much gas is there. This is still super reliable after 200 years.
Other important factors include the prohibition of open lights or naked lights and the proper installation and maintenance of electrical equipment. The working rule at the Pretoria Pit was a half-inch cap or flame at the coal face, indicating between 2 and 3% gas, sufficient to fence off, meaning that no one was permitted to work there. The fireman is a mining official responsible for testing for gas in the workings and reporting his findings in a log. It was a common practice at the Pretoria for firemen to report giving off gas diluted as made. This meant, of course, that no gas could be detected a short distance away from the coal face.
There were rumours that Pretoria was a gassy mine. There is evidence of men being sent home because of the presence of gas.
There are numerous accounts of gas being encountered at the Pretoria Pit, and it was apparently common knowledge in the area. The wife of one miner, Albert Lonsdale, said that her husband had complained of gas often. The son of another miner, Matthew Seddon, said his father had worked at the mine for 4 years. On several occasions had to run to the shaft bottom out of the mine workings, due to gas coming off the face and putting the safety lamps out. Other miners complained of the atmosphere in the mine being very hot. Again, the father of a young miner, James MacDonald, said his son returned home 3 mornings out of 6 on account of there being gas present in the workings. In fact, 2 days before the explosion, on the 18th of December, 2% fire damp was present near the roof and against the coal face in a recess at the furthest end of number 1 jig in the North Plodder district.
George Ratcliffe, in charge of the mechanical coal cutter, is the last man to leave the yard level at around 6:40 a.m. on the morning of 21st December. All seemed in order. 6:45 a.m. The day shift descended to bring up the coal that had been mined during the previous night. 7:50 a.m. The ground shook for miles around when the Pretoria Pit exploded. Richard, a youngster in central Atherton, about a mile from the mine, heard the explosion. He didn't realise its significance until later that day. Ernest Corner, a boy of 10 at the time, was woken at 7:50 by a sudden thump and the bed shaking. His father had just returned home from the night shift at the Chequerbent Pit and said to him, That's Pretoria gone up. The mine manager, Alfred Tong, who was having breakfast, heard the report at 7:50 a.m. and headed towards the mine.
The explosion had occurred at 7:50 a.m. It was now 8:10. To illustrate the strength of that explosion, I would talk about the man who farmed, a local farmer who farmed the home farm on the Bolton estate, a man called Richard Jackson, Dick Jackson. And he spoke to me, he was an old man when he told me, that he had gone out early morning to do some winter ploughing. He had with him a 2 steel and iron plough and a bucket seat, metal bucket seat on the back, 2 Shire horses, and he was just beginning to plough when the mine went up. He was working in a field some 250, 300 yards from the actual pit itself. The explosion lifted him, the plough and the Shire horses off the floor 2 or 3 foot and dropped them back down again. Other farmers in the area told that the hawthorn hedges, which are common in this part of the world, which divided the fields, were pulled flat to the ground, so there's a massive implosion as well as a number of explosions. After 24 hours, these bushes righted themselves and came up right again. So the effect, if you feel the sense of the bang and the explosion that it had, massive. My mother at 8.5 years told me that she lived in Mabel Street, which was about 1.5 miles down the line, just near Daisy Hill Station, adjacent to Daisy Hill Station, when the explosion occurred. It knocked her on her backside, on the floor, and she ran into the house to my grandmother, who took her to the window, out to the window to see all the neighbours running up the road, running down to the railway station to get up the line to get to the pit because they knew what had happened. The whistles were blowing and the ladies were there, in many of them in their night dresses with coats, clothing over them, and they just made for the pit as fast as they could.
The explosion happened on the 21st of December 1910 at approximately 7:52 a.m. and we know this from the discovery of a pocket watch on the body of one of the miners. The glass in the case had been broken and scorched, and the fingers had stopped at exactly 7:52 a.m. And this watch can be seen on display in West Bolton Library in what is known as the Pretoria Collection.
The engine tenter entered Greensmith's weaving shed at 8 a.m. Something he seldom did. The weavers' faces went white. One woman fainted, then another. The gates to the factory were locked until dinner time, so the weaver spent a nervous morning speculating on what could have happened. 8:10 a.m. Alfred Tong arrived at the pit. Smoke was coming out of number 3 shaft. The casing had been partially wrecked by the explosion, making it impossible to descend in the cage. He went to number 4 shaft.
This had been damaged to a lesser extent. Signal wires and cage bearers were broken, and one of the cages was stuck. Another cage appeared to be free, and Alfred Tong and some of the other men started to free it.
8:40 a.m. Sergeant Major Hill, in charge of the nearby Howe Bridge Rescue Station, arrived at the mine with emergency apparatus. 9 a.m. Alfred Tong took 8 men with him and descended in silence in the number 4 shaft cage.
There was a number of people went down in it, and we have the list of people here who were in the first cage that went down. The first person in the cage was, of course, the general manager, Mr. Alfred Tong. And then there was an electrical fireman by the name of Henry Polly. James Moss, a shaftsman, and John Hilton, shaftsmen, they too were in. William Martland, a fireman, and John Hardman, a fireman from one of the other pits. Both of these men went down. Robert Roberts was a fireman. John Herring and James Hartley, too, were firemen.
On the way down, the cage continually got stuck on various obstacles, and they wondered whether the cage would make it.
By 9:05 in the morning, the cage reached the Trencherbourne mine, where Llewellyn Williams, the under-manager, was at the mouthing. Alfred asked if all the men were safe, and he said yes, but some were suffering slightly from fumes.
Richard, the youngster in Atherton, met a man named Billy Davis, who told him the pit had exploded. Richard asked which one. The yard mine was the answer. Richard went straight home to tell his mother and then immediately to the pit. His father, brother Lewis, and uncles Stanley and Jim were all down the pit that day.
Llewellyn got into the cage and travelled down with Alfred. The cage reached the yard mouthing, where considerable wreckage from the explosion was evident. The underground fan had been blown inwards towards the number 4 shaft, indicating that the explosive force had gone from west to east. The atmosphere was very hot, with a presence of afterdamp. The only ventilating fan in operation was the one in the Trenchbone mine. The men found dead bodies everywhere. One survivor, named Byers, was found and carried to the cage. He was severely burned all over his body. Although he made it to the surface, sadly, he died the following day.
10:30 a.m. A youth called Gibson was brought to the surface.
He was found entirely naked, badly burned all over and covered in a thick layer of coal dust. He lived only a short time before dying from shock.
11 a.m. A crowd started to gather at the pithead, waiting for news of their menfolk.
A contingent of the Bolton Borough Police were in attendance to maintain some form of order. The crowd grew as the day wore on. Men were frantically working to repair the fan at the surface to resume ventilation.
Meanwhile, below ground, the cage slowly descended to a lower yard mouthing, where they found a lad called Staveley.
Joseph Staveley, aged 16, son of James, head surface manager, is a handsome grey-eyed lad. His duties required him regularly to go down the pit, and he was well acquainted with the roads. Then came the explosion. A great gust of wind brushed him and his companions about. Next came a deafening report. He has an impression of soft bodies striking him, of something heavy which hurtled past by in the darkness, and of the immense force which wrapped itself around him and swept him off his feet. The shaft was in complete darkness.
On the surface, 40 men had arrived from local mines to help with the rescue operation. It was arranged that special squads would not be underground longer than 2 hours, and every team carried a canary in a cage as an advance warning of gas. In fact, canaries were bred for this specific purpose and kept in mine rescue headquarters. A temporary hospital was set up in the miners' union room under the control of Dr. Mallet from Bolton Infirmary. Meanwhile, the cage had arrived at the Arley seam at the very bottom of the shaft. When Alfred and the others arrived there, it was obvious that there was a panic situation, with men crying to be taken to the surface. Alfred maintained order and insisted that most ill men should be placed in the cage first, and then they would return for the rest. The men responded to this plea, and Alfred started to get the men out of the mine.
Miners nearest the explosion died instantly. Its power blew some literally to pieces. One man was found impaled almost the whole length of his body on a piece of timber.
James Holt was literally lifted off his feet and carried 12 to 14 yards. A boy called Roberts, who was near the pit eye, which is the pit eye, bottom of the pit, was knocked over on his face and had his leg broken. George Byers heard the explosion like a great bump. He and 4 others made for the pit eye, their first instinct being to get to the shaft where they could be rescued. He stumbled and fell and remembered nothing. He'd been found by his brother James Byers, a member of a rescue party, who had carried and dragged him some 400 yards to safety.
12 o'clock. All 545 men in the Trenchbone and Arley mines had been raised to the surface. The ill were treated in the makeshift hospital. Most suffered from fumes. 4 local doctors were in attendance: Blakemore, Russell, Lee and Rackler. The injured were taken by special train to Bolton and then to Bolton Royal Infirmary. 12:20 p.m. A fire was found at an air crossing on the east level. Some men were left to put it out, and Alfred continued through the workings to see if he could find any more fires. Mr. Gerard, HM Inspector of Mines, had arrived along with other mining engineers. Meanwhile, the men were still engaged in putting out the fires in the east level and the Downbrow district. Massive roof falls were found, some 200 yards long, involving tons of material. The rescue teams were still hopeful of finding other men alive. A man called Davenport was found. He was given a drink and sent to the surface. He was found near a manhole, where there was sufficient air to keep him alive. 1 p.m. The crowds were gathering during the day. Some women were angry because they said their men had told them that it was a gassy mine, and they were afraid of something like this happening. The joiner's shop at the mine was converted into a makeshift mortuary for purposes of identification. During the afternoon, rescuers worked continually in shifts to search for survivors and to resume circulating air throughout the workings.
The rescue squads were supplied with the first ever breathing apparatus, the Proto.
The thing that came to light is that about the Mines Rescue Unit at Howbridge was that